Election 93. This week from Winnipeg, National Party leader Mel Hurtig. In Toronto, here's your host, Robert Fisher.
Hello and welcome to Focus Election 93. The National Party of Canada was formed in November of last year and has been dismissed by many, but has a growing following, an appeal to nationalists, a very Canadian viewpoint. To talk about what the party stands for, its policies and its principles, we're joined this week from our CKND studios in Winnipeg by the party leader, Mel Hurtig. On our panel this week, Global News reporter Robin SMYTHE and Global News anchor Jane Gilbert. Mel Hurtig and the National Party when Focus Election 93 continues.
Natural.
Welcome to Focus and welcome to our program, Mr. Hurtig.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Can we start with the assumption that not even you expects your party to form the next government? And if we agree on that, can you tell me what your goals are in this election?
Well, rather than having Lucien Bouchard, the separatist who's threatening to hold a knife at the throat of Canada in the next parliament, and he's bragging about how he's going to make parliament dance, rather than having him hold the balance of power in a minority government, or rather than having Preston Manning on the extreme right of the political spectrum holding the balance of power and then seeing our Canada's social programs decapitated, I'd much rather that our party, the National Party of Canada, held the balance of power in the next House of Commons.
For what it's worth, the polls have not been kind to you and the National Party. I think national support among decided voters is at 2%. It goes to 4% in British Columbia. What role do you see for your party in this election? Is it one of spoiling other candidates' chances of winning to keep Liberals and New Democrats out of the House of Commons?
Oh, no, you must never say that. We're going to win seats in this House of Commons. We're running to win. We've got super candidates all across the country, wonderful men and women, and lots of young candidates. I'm really pleased. The head of our organization in British Columbia phoned yesterday. He says, Mel, I think we've got a chance of winning 5 or 6 seats. We've got seats all across the country in Southern Ontario, Winnipeg, in Edmonton, for example, in British Columbia. We're going to win those seats. We're going to surprise. Tell you what we're going to do. We're going to surprise the heck out of the political establishment in this country. You just watch.
Robin SMYTHE.
And yet, Mr. Hurtig, when I spoke with you in Toronto in August, you had said to me at that point you hope to run more than 100 candidates, reaching almost 150. You haven't reached that point yet, and we've already come into the campaign. Can you realistically hope to win some seats?
Hey, guess what, Robin? Guess what I announced last night in Edmonton at a big rally where we had 700 people show up at a rally in my own riding. We have 102 candidates as of last night, and we're going right for 155, and I'm optimistic. Let me tell you this, we're going to have twice as many candidates as the Bloc, who they're allowing to participate in the televised debate. The Bloc, who's only running in one province and only having 75 candidates. We're running in all 10 provinces, and by the way, we'll have Francophone and Anglophone candidates in Quebec, and we're going for that 155 number.
Okay, I'll tell you what, let's give you a chance right now to talk about some of the policies of your party. One of the things I'm interested in is the National Party stand on taxes. You say you would scrap the GST. We hear that also from the Liberals, but they're talking about replacing it with a fairer tax. Would you replace the GST? Would people still have to be paying some sort of GST?
Well, I think the Liberal policy is a joke. That's the policies of the 1960s. Chrétien is saying it's the old Keith Davies style. He says, come and see me after the election and we'll tell you how we're going to replace the GST. Well, people aren't going to buy that. That's nonsense. And I think the Liberal Party is being hammered for that sort of thing. They tried to get away with that in the free trade agreement as well. We are the only party that says we're going to get rid of the GST within 1 year of taking office. And before the election, not after the election, not come and see me after the election and I'll explain. Before the election, we'll set out line by line by line exactly where we're going to get the additional revenue. And I'll tell you what, it is not going to be from average Canadian taxpayers. It's going to be from doing something about transfer pricing, the foreign corporations getting away with murder and transferring their profits out of Canada before they're taxed. We're going to close down the tax havens that the Auditor General talked about in his last report, $2 billion worth of additional tax revenue there. So we will spell it out line by line. The GST is a very unfair and non-progressive tax.
Jane Gilbert.
Well, but Mr. Hurtig, your numbers don't appear to add up. I mean, if you're going to cut so much in terms of the GST, and yet at the same time promise universal health care, promise the social programs, promise more money for education, where is all this money going to come from? It just doesn't seem to add up.
Well, don't assume that our numbers don't add up before you quiz me about all of our policies, because our numbers really do add up. I'll give you one simple example. If we had a better governor of the Bank of Canada than John Crow, and by the way, we would fire him the very first morning as a government and replace him with an economist who had a better understanding of how monetary theory has to interrelate with other economic policies. If our interest rates on the national debt had only been 1% lower during the last decade, and they should have been more than 1%, by the way, lower, but 1% lower, we would have saved $43 billion in debt financing costs during the past decade, and there would be no problems today with Medicare, no problems with social programs, and no problems with the financing of post-secondary education as well. So that's one of many, many similar policies we have for turning the Canadian economy around. If I can just add something very quickly, anybody who tells you that social programs are responsible for our deficits and our debt doesn't know what they're talking about, because they have gone up this much as a percentage of government spending, whereas a whole bunch of other things have gone up by this much by comparison.
Well, you've certainly also spoken about the free trade agreement, and you've said that you will scrap the free trade agreement. And in looking at the numbers and blaming the FTA for job losses, do you negate the impact of a worldwide recession?
We have a wonderful new policy document called Jobs for All Canadians, which we're releasing chapter by chapter in various parts of the country, and which will be available in total well before the election. And we have a chapter showing the international comparisons, showing how Canada did compared to the G7 nations, compared to the OECD nations, and compared to the European Community nations. And boy, would I be thrilled to have the kind of international recession that all of those other 23 OECD countries have. We have performed so poorly by comparison, and boy, anybody who's watching this show and wants to have a copy of those comparisons, I'm going to give you a toll-free number, 1-800-565-8673, and I'd be delighted to send those out to them.
Sounds a lot like the Ross Perot campaign, Mr. Hurtig.
He's been copying me for quite some time.
Let me ask you, because we've introduced the subject of taxes. I think if you travel this country, the first thing that people would tell you is the system is unfair, heavily weighted against the guy in the middle, if you will, and the corporations seem to be getting away with murder, as you pointed out earlier. What are you going to do about that? How do you make the tax system fair so that the little guy in the middle doesn't get dinged all the time?
Well, in our tax section of the document that we have just released, we show very clearly that average Canadians pay way too much tax compared to average citizens in all the other developed nations in the world. But the big corporations, I'm not talking about the average small Canadian-owned corporation, the big corporations, 40% of them are foreign-owned and controlled, do not begin to pay even close to their fair share of taxes compared to those corporations in other developed nations in the world. If they just paid the same, I don't want them to pay more, but if they paid, the big corporations just simply paid the same average that they do in the other developed nations in the world, we would be able to reduce individual income taxes in Canada by at least $5 billion every year.
On that note, Mr. Hurtig, we'll take a break and be back with more Focus after these messages. Mr. Hurtig, I hesitate to use the phrase, but I will anyway. When we talk about social programs, are they for you a sacred trust? Are you going to have to tinker with social programs to implement the National Party program should you form a government after the 25th of October?
Our party is very strong believers in universal health care and universal social programs. If you have universal social programs, you don't create a society of the haves and the have-nots, and also they're infinitely cheaper to administer. For example, I'll give you one quick example. There are more people employed in the tiny little state of Massachusetts in the administration of health care in the United States than there are in the entire country of Canada. They're very fair, but you also have to have a progressive tax system as well, so that the tax system is fair as well. And if you've got those two things going, you avoid the stigma of means tests and a have and have-not society.
Are you leading, though, in some ways? I mean, some systems in this government, in this country, provincial governments are moving towards what they don't like to talk about, but there are user fees out there.
Yep.
Are we
Yep.
going to see more of that in order to pay for health care to maintain the level that we've all become accustomed to?
The National Party of Canada, the minute we saw any province breaking any of the 5 basic fundamentals of universal health care, such as applying a user fee that you mentioned, we would stop the transfer payments from Ottawa to that province until they changed their mind, and I guarantee you they would change their mind pretty quickly. Health care and social programs are not the problem. It's bad monetary policy, it's bad trade policy, it's bad exchange rate policy, it's bad tax policy and investment policy. And we're totally convinced that we can continue to have the excellent social programs that we have in Canada. In fact, in many ways, you know, we do not spend, compared to GDP, on social programs what they do in many other European countries, and yet many of those other European countries have better growth rates than Canada does.
Jane.
I'm curious, Mr. Hurtig, the Prime Minister, both during the leadership campaign and I suppose during this campaign as well, has talked about changing the way in which we do politics in this country. It's become a bit of a buzz phrase. You have definite views on how you would change the structure of government and how you would implement checks and balances on government. Just how would you do that?
Well, a couple of quick ways. We're the only party that says we should strengthen the office of the Auditor General of Canada and make sure that every government contract that is awarded on the basis of an open tendering system, a competitive tendering system, instead of on the basis of patronage and pork barrel and who knows who in the Prime Minister's office or in the Defense Department or in the Treasury Board. We want to clean up Ottawa. It's one of the you know, when Brian came along, there was 100 lobbyists in Ottawa. There's now 3,000 lobbyists in Ottawa selling access to the government. Kim Campbell says we're going to shed more light on the lobbying system. The National Party of Canada says we are going to disallow the corporate expensing of lobbying fees, and after the election there's going to be Kim Campbell looking for a new job and also 3,000 lobbyists in Ottawa looking for a new job as well. We'd like to return the decision-making process to the duly democratically elected members of Parliament instead.
Robin.
Mr. Hurtig, considering the skepticism of voters today, we've heard the word cranky or grumpy to refer to how the voters are feeling out there. Do you find that you're getting any kind of reception at all, or are people so skeptical to the point that they're saying, I'm looking for a new alternative, but I really just can't trust politicians, period?
Well, there is a lot of that. I'd be very dishonest with you if I didn't tell you that there's an awful lot of people. I think the Mulroney government and the latter years of the Trudeau government have really turned people off democracy in this country, and it's very, very sad. And one of the manifestations of that is you don't get very many people involved in the democratic process. As a result, last year 0.7% of adult Canadians made a donation to any political party. So that leaves the funding of the political process up to big business and big trade unions. It's one of the biggest problems that we have. But having said that, I can't believe, especially since we've been kicked out of those televised debates, I can't believe the number of people who are stopping me on the street or phoning or sending in checks and saying, hey, we're with you all the way, you're new and you're different and we like what you're talking about.
Let's pick up on a point you made there. You talk about the payments to political parties from big unions, from big business. Your party as a policy doesn't accept donations from either of those groups. How do you plan to finance your party to continue to get your ideas across and to continue to have a platform even after the October 25th election?
Well, we're budgeting to have 405. Look, first of all, in the election itself, we're only going to spend $1.8 million compared to at least 10.6 by the other parties. But we're budgeting to have $400,000 left after the election campaign. And gee, the donations are starting to come in from individuals. By the way, we've sent back about 200 corporate donations already. We just got a check the other day from a lady we don't know in northern Manitoba for $15,000. Wonderful Canadians are supporting us like that. And there's one really interesting thing that happened that I have to mention. October 26th, the Charlottetown referendum, I believe, was the beginning of a democratic revolution in this country. You had all of the elite on the one side, the Liberals, the Conservatives, the NDP, the bankers, the trade unions, etc., and they spent tens of millions of dollars. And boy, you know, the other side spent $1 or $2 million, and it was the people who won. So we're hoping we're going to be able to continue to be part of that democratic process.
Mr. Hurtig, you've raised the issue twice, so I'm going to pick up where you've raised it. You're talking about the the leadership debates in this election campaign. Why is it the old line parties don't want you involved? I mean, you $1.8 million campaign, that's peanuts.
Yeah.
You're not running a full slate of candidates in every riding. You've only been around since November 1992, and yet everybody seems to be afraid of Mel Hurtig. Why is that?
I don't know, and we really object to the process. I think that decisions like that should always be made in public. They shouldn't be made behind closed doors by network executives who say arbitrarily, well, there should only be 5 people in on the debate. And you know, the Democrats, when they had their convention to select a presidential candidate in the last 1992 in the U.S., they had 7 people in on their debates. So I don't see any reason why a party who is running in at least half the ridings in the country and running in all 10 provinces shouldn't be included, especially when they let Preston in, for example, who's not running in the province of Quebec at all, and they let the separatist Mr. Bouchard in.
But you have no seats, no representation. I mean, I suppose some people might wonder, Mr. Hurtig, whether you are serious about this whole venture, or is this just another Hurtig scheme for a little publicity? I mean, are you going to be around in the next election? Maybe that's one of the main questions that Canadians like to know. Is this a long-term commitment by you to build a brand new political party in this country?
We are sinking really deep roots across this country. You should come to some of our meetings, 700, 800, 900, 1,100 people in Vancouver the other night. We have terrific, committed people, and we have a higher percentage of young people in our party than in any other party in this country. And you know what I'm telling them? I'm telling them, look, I want you guys to come and take over this party within 2 or 3 years. And I'm thrilled by the quality of people we have. But I have to go back to a point you made earlier. You should never, never, never make a decision about what happens in a 1993 election based on what happened 5 years ago in 1988. That's not the way you should determine free time or the amount of time you can buy or who should be on televised debates.
I have to just tell you quickly, Mr. Hurtig, you're the only National Party leader who I've received mail about asked to be on the show. Now, I don't know what that means necessarily, but I did have one letter last week from a viewer saying, put Mel Hurtig on television. You don't have to respond to that. I'm going to take a break. We'll be back with more Focus after these messages. As we talk to Mel Hurtig. Mr. Hurtig, you say you'd make education in this country a federal priority. Are you saying that you think the provinces have failed in their responsibilities in this area?
Well, I think we really have to do things better than we have been. All the comparisons that we have had recently show that we're falling behind. But let me tell you what I'm finding across the country as I travel from St. John's to Victoria. I'm finding an incredible number of young people out there who cannot now afford to go to post-secondary institutions, whether it's universities or technical schools or colleges or whatever. They can't find part-time jobs, they can't find summer jobs, the tuition fees have gone up, the admission marks have gone up. We're wasting much of a whole generation of young people. So our party policy is no tuition fees for post-secondary education. But you go to the University of Toronto and you become a doctor and you're earning $400,000 a year, you pay back the entire cost of your education through the income tax system over a protracted period of time, much fairer than the present system.
Mr. Hurtig, that seems to be a very controversial promise. And I'm wondering, the second part of that promise, I guess, that I've been reading about, is your promise that if you do get a degree in university, a paid-for degree by the taxpayers, but you end up with a low-paying job, then you don't have to pay it back.
Well, you pay back a little bit, but again, the whole income tax system, if it's a progressive system, if you're earning $400,000 a year compared to $4,000 a year, obviously the taxes you pay back would be less. And I'll go beyond that. If you end up with a BA and you become a homemaker, for example, you don't have to pay back the cost of your education. And you know what? Society will be enriched as a result of this program.
Well, Mr. Hurtig, I understand why you don't find any solace in the Conservative platform, and you've written extensively about why you've left the Liberal Party. But I wonder why you didn't find a home within the NDP, and in creating your own party, are you not splitting the anti-free trade vote?
Well, look, I'm not a socialist. We're not as far left as the NDP is. We've got a terrific number of really great business persons, men and women in the party. I totally disagree with the NDP position on the Charlottetown Accord, and that's one of the reasons why 25% of our members have come to us from the NDP, is how they rejected the fact that the NDP got locked into this terrible Charlottetown agreement and bought a pile of stuff that they shouldn't have bought. We're very different from the NDP in a whole bunch of other ways. We're the only party saying and this is very, very important in our platform, we say you cannot control your own future if you don't own your own country. We've been talking about that now for quite some time. The NDP has stopped talking about it, but how can Audrey McLaughlin talk about that now when Bob Rae and Mike Harcourt are selling off the ownership and control of their province every day? So we're very different. Splitting the vote, well look, if splitting the vote was the only criteria you talked about, the CCF and the NDP would never have been born in the first place. The Reform Party wouldn't have been born, and many, many governments who are now in power in the Western European democracies would never be on the scene if that was the criteria. The only time you ever think about forming a new party is if you think that the existing parties have been doing a very poor job, and that's what we think.
I need a quick answer to this one, Mr. Hurtig. If you found yourself in the House of Commons with just a few seats, you were not holding the balance of power, where would you put your allegiance? Would you form any kind of coalition with another party sitting in the House, and if so, where?
No, we would not form a coalition. We would vote for good legislation whenever good legislation was presented to us, but we would vote against bad legislation whenever we saw it.
Mr. Hurtig, when you travel this country, I think the one theme that you get from Canadians, certainly the message I received a year ago as I traveled this country on another program, that people just simply don't trust their politicians anymore. So how does Mel Hurtig restore the trust in Canadians out there, trust in the system, and faith that, in fact, our elected representatives are going to do a good job for us in Ottawa?
Okay, one of the things we would like to do is take to the people of Canada a binding referendum asking them if they would like to shorten the term of office. We think 5 years now is way too long. Last 2 or 3 years are the only period in my lifetime when the people of Canada were praying for an impeachment process. We would like to see the term of office shortened to 3 or 4 years. We'd like to have the date for the election taken away from the Prime Minister so you don't get Kim Campbell and others flying around the country at the taxpayers' expense. If the rascals are not doing a good job, let us give the people of Canada an opportunity to throw them out of office much more frequently in the future.
And the promises you make in this election campaign are the promises you will in fact keep if you should occupy 24 Sussex after the 25th?
Well, we have an unusual idea that we're bouncing around with a bunch of political scientists right now, and we're going to evolve this idea. But we think that people of Canada are sick and tired of politicians who break their promises. So we think that there should be some mechanism whereby a government that breaks a major election campaign promise, for example, the Tories went to the people in 1988 on a national child care program. If you break a major election promise, you should be forced to resign within a certain period of time and call a new federal election.
Mr. Hurtig, I must interrupt. That's our time for this week. Thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
This has been Focus, Election 93. Our guest this week, National Party leader from Winnipeg, Mel Hurtig. On our panel this week, Global News reporter Robin SMYTHE and Global News anchor Jane Gilbert. And thank you for watching. I'm Robert Fisher. Join me again next week for another edition of Focus, Election 93.